There is a financial framework roughly 2,000 years old. It survived Roman occupation, the collapse of entire empires, 2 world wars, and the longest sustained economic persecution in recorded history. And the community that carried it quietly across all of that now represents less than 0.2% of the global population and a share of multi-generational wealth that defies every statistical model ever built to explain it. In every mainstream financial conversation I have ever encountered, nobody mentions it. That stops today. Hi, I'm Buck. And today we're going to rethink how money really works. If you've ever done everything right on paper and still felt like the walls were slowly closing in, you're exactly where this conversation is meant to find you. Let's begin with what you actually believe about money. Not what you've read, not what you'd say in a conversation designed to make you sound responsible. What you believe functionally in the decisions you make every week. For most people, the working model looks like this. Money comes in. Some of it goes toward your life, and whatever survives that process gets set aside for later. Spend and save. 2 buckets, 2 directions. The entire architecture of conventional personal finance is constructed around those 2 categories, and the advice is almost always a variation on the same instruction. Take less from the first bucket so there is more for the second. It isn't wrong advice, but it is incomplete in a way that carries a cost, and the cost is not denominated in dollars. The Talmud, the foundational text of Jewish law, ethics, and practical wisdom, compiled and debated across centuries of scholarship, contains a specific instruction about how a person should divide what they earn. It appears in Tractate Bava Metzia. The instruction is precise. Divide your holdings into thirds. 1/3 in land, real, tangible stable assets that hold value across uncertainty. 1/3 in commerce, liquid, working capital that generates activity and moves with opportunity. And 1/3 kept in hand, available, accessible, present. Now consider what that instruction actually represents. A tradition stress, tested against 2,000 years of some of the most severe economic conditions in recorded human history. Communities repeatedly stripped of property, excluded from entire industries, forced to rebuild across generations, did not arrive at a 3-part structure by coincidence. The scholars who codified this were not writing financial theory for prosperous times. They were distilling lived observation, the accumulated understanding of what allowed families and entire communities to remain intact, adaptable, and ultimately sovereign, across circumstances specifically designed to destroy exactly that. That third category, the one kept in hand, was not emergency savings in the way we use that phrase today. It was something older and more deliberate. It was the recognition that a person without accessible resources is not fully free, regardless of what their balance sheet indicates. That the ability to move, to respond to opportunity, to exit a deteriorating situation without catastrophe, to make a decision under pressure from a position of genuine choice, required its own dedicated capital. Capital held not for eventual spending, but for the maintenance of agency itself. In a word, freedom capital, and the sustained, multi-generational financial resilience of the communities that practice this principle, even under conditions that should have made accumulation statistically impossible, was not unrelated, I would argue, to the fact that they treated freedom as a line item. This is the 33-33 rule, not a modern productivity concept dressed in numbers, a very old idea about human dignity, expressed in the language of money. Let me tell you about Elena. Elena worked in pharmaceutical sales for 11 years. She was genuinely good at it, built real expertise, earned genuine respect, developed the kind of professional reputation that arrives in a room before she does. By her mid-30s, she had a retirement account. Her financial advisor described as ahead of schedule, a lifestyle she had carefully constructed to feel considered rather than extravagant, and a career she had every reason to feel proud of. Then the acquisition happened. Her company was purchased by a larger one. Within 4 months, the culture she had helped build, the specific texture of how decisions were made, the values that had made the work feel like more than a transaction, was gone. What replaced it was something she didn't recognize. She knew this clearly by month 2. She stayed for 22 more, not because she was afraid of change, not because she lacked options, because she had no runway. Her retirement savings were locked behind age restrictions and early withdrawal penalties. Her emergency fund covered roughly 11 weeks of expenses. To leave well, not desperately, not into the arms of the first offer that arrived. She needed time, 4 to 6 months of clear, accessible, penalty-free time to search properly and choose deliberately. She had 11 weeks, so she stayed. And over those 22 months, something happened that had nothing to do with performance reviews or quarterly numbers. She told me this herself, a diminished version of the person she had been. Less willing to speak in meetings where speaking mattered. Less willing to challenge decisions she knew were wrong. Less willing to advocate for the people on her team whose situations deserved advocacy. Because her advocacy had no real weight when she could not afford to lose the position from which she was advocating, she began softening her language, deferring to opinions she didn't respect, becoming agreeable in rooms where she had previously been useful. When she finally left, she sat in the parking structure for 20 minutes before she could drive, not from relief, from anger at how long it had taken. At the version of herself that had quietly taken up residence in the interim. It is easy to draw the wrong lesson from Elena's story. Let me be precise about what it actually teaches. She was not financially reckless. She had not made the choices that financial media has spent years converting into morality tales about discipline and self-control. She was doing exactly what she had been taught, spending deliberately, saving for retirement, maintaining an emergency fund. She had followed the two-bucket system with genuine care. The two-bucket system had still left her without the one thing she actually needed, because the two-bucket system has no room for freedom. It was not designed to include it. It treats every dollar as either a present expense or a future expense, and it never asks what happens in the specific gap where the present becomes genuinely unbearable, and the future is locked behind a penalty clause. Elena fell into that gap, and because the gap has no name in conventional financial planning, she didn't see it coming until she was already inside it. That is the missing room in most people's financial architecture. And you cannot live in a room that doesn't exist. Let's be precise about what freedom capital actually is. The most common misread of this framework is treating it as a synonym for savings, and the distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. An emergency fund is reactive by design. It responds to problems. The car breaks down, the medical bill arrives, the unexpected expense lands on a random Tuesday, and the emergency fund absorbs the shock, preventing a setback from becoming a crisis. That function is critically important. Do not dismantle yours. Freedom capital is different in purpose, even when the two share the same account in practice. An emergency fund is defensive. Freedom capital is offensive. It is the accessible, liquid pool of money whose presence means that when something worth reaching for appears, an opportunity, a better position, a risk with real upside, an exit from a situation that has quietly been costing you, you can actually reach for it, without penalty, without the grinding internal calculation of everything you stand to lose by moving. Protection is one thing, agency is another. And agency, the lived, felt sense that you are making decisions rather than having decisions made for you by the structural constraints of your balance sheet, turns out to be one of the most consistent contributors to human well-being that researchers across multiple disciplines have identified. Across income levels, across cultures, across professional contexts. The people who report the highest life satisfaction are not the wealthiest on average. They are the ones who feel most in genuine control of how their significant choices are made. Freedom capital is the financial infrastructure of that feeling. The Talmudic scholars encoded this 2 millennia before behavioral economics existed as a field. The third kept in hand was not idle money waiting to be useful. It was sovereignty money, the material expression of a community-level belief that no external force, no employer, no creditor, no deteriorating circumstance should have final authority over a person's decisions. That belief had survival value across centuries of genuine threat. It has survival value now in conditions far less dramatic, but no less real. Here is where this framework most commonly gets misapplied. It is worth addressing before it becomes the reason someone dismisses it entirely. Someone hears 33, and begins calculating immediately. A third to the present, a third to the future, a third to freedom. Within 45 seconds, they discover the mortgage alone exceeds a third of take-home income, and the framework begins to feel like advice designed for people with more favorable math than theirs. That is a misreading. The 33 rule is not a formula. It is an orientation. What it demands is not the perfect arithmetic division of every paycheck into equal thirds. What it demands is that you hold 3 values simultaneously: present, future, and freedom, rather than allowing any 2 of them to permanently crowd out the third. Specifically, it insists that freedom capital be treated as a category with the same fundamental legitimacy as retirement contributions and monthly expenses, not as a remainder, not as something funded after everything else has been addressed. Because in that position, it will almost never get funded. Something always competes. Something always arrives feeling more urgent. The unexpected bill, the overdue repair, the opportunity that appeared from nowhere. Freedom capital. If it waits its turn, waits forever. The ratio between the three categories shifts with life. That is normal. A living financial system bends with a living life. But the existence of all three categories must not shift. The moment freedom capital becomes the first thing released under pressure, the cage begins assembling itself, quietly, one reasonable and defensible decision at a time, until the walls have arrived and there is no memory of building them. The present third deserves more attention than it usually receives in these conversations. Most people hear a framework involving a dedicated freedom account and immediately assume it means spending less now. Tightening further, adding another category of sacrifice to a list that is already long. But that reading misses what the present third is actually for. The present third is not permission to spend carelessly. It is permission to spend intentionally, with the understanding that a financial plan experienced as sustained self-deprivation is not a sustainable plan. It is a plan with an expiration date, and the expiration tends to arrive with consequences disproportionate to whatever was saved during the austerity. Research on financial behavior adherence is consistent here. People who construct plans that offer nothing to their present selves do not, on average, outperform those with more livable plans. What they produce instead is a higher probability of collapse, followed by sharp overcorrection. Pressure accumulates, releases suddenly, and the release undoes significant amounts of what the discipline had built. This is not a character flaw. It is a design flaw. The present third exists as an engineering decision, because your current self has to remain genuinely willing to maintain the system. And willingness requires that the system feel chosen rather than imposed. The meal that matters, the trip that restores something in you, the experience that makes a week feel fully inhabited rather than merely survived. These are not indulgences to be apologized for. They are investments in the durability of everything the other two-thirds are building. A structure you actually want to live in will be maintained. One that feels like a sentence will eventually be escaped. Now, here is the turn this conversation has been building toward, and it is not the turn you are expecting. The 33-33-33 rule is not primarily about money. It is about the relationship between your financial architecture and your identity. Specifically, the way that sustained financial constraint, quietly, gradually, without announcement, begins to change the person you are willing to be. Elena experienced this. She didn't observe it happening in real time. The change was gradual enough to feel like adaptation rather than erosion. One softened sentence became a pattern. One withheld opinion became a posture. 22 months in, she was a professional who had learned, not consciously, but at some deeper register, that her voice carried a risk she could no longer afford. That is not weakness. That is a structural outcome. Cognitive science has a useful frame for what happens. Financial scarcity occupies mental bandwidth persistently, not dramatically, not as an acute crisis you can identify and address, but as a continuous background process, consuming the cognitive capacity that would otherwise be available for ambitious thinking, creative risk, and the kind of long-view decision, making that builds a genuinely good life. You don't experience it as thinking about money. You experience it as a subtle narrowing, a quiet, increasingly automatic preference for the option that requires the least disruption. Freedom capital interrupts that process. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough that decisions can be made from expansion rather than contraction. Enough that when a room requires your honest voice, you have one to offer. Marcus, someone I've referenced before in this channel, described it this way. He said, "The account isn't something I think about, but I feel it. Every time I walk into a room where something important is being decided, I feel it. Not as a number, as a posture. Like standing up straight, that is the real return on freedom capital. It does not appear in any compound interest calculator. It shows up in the quality of your decisions, the reach of your ambitions, and the person you remain under genuine pressure." Elena built the account 14 months after she left that company. She didn't call it an emergency fund. She already had one of those. She typed one word on the label when she opened the new account available. She funded it automatically monthly, with an amount that felt almost embarrassingly modest at first. But the discipline was never about the size. It was about the category, the deliberate, protected acknowledgement that freedom capital has a distinct job, and that job deserves its own protected space, insulated specifically from the moments when something else always seems more urgent. Something always does. 18 months later, the account held enough to provide 6 clear months of runway. She has not needed to access it in the practical sense. It sits, liquid, available, earning modest interest while she continues to build. But here is what she told me. When her current employer made a significant decision she disagreed with, one that affected people she was responsible for. In a room full of people with every incentive to stay silent, she spoke, clearly, directly, without softening the language she knew was right. She said she felt the account when she did it, not as a thought, as something steadier than a thought, something in the background, quiet, unwavering, available. That is what freedom capital actually feels like when it exists, not a spreadsheet line item. A posture. The difference between a person who speaks from genuine choice and a person who speaks only when there is nothing left to lose. Those two people can look identical from across a conference table. They are not the same. Here is the quiet thing all of this has been building toward. The reason this framework survived 2,000 years, through occupations, expulsions, and economic upheavals that collapsed every surrounding system, is not that it is mathematically elegant. Though it is that it accounts for something most modern financial frameworks never once name. Money is not the end product. The end product is a life in which you remain the primary author of your own decisions, across time, across setbacks, across the moments when someone or something is offering you a very good reason to compromise the direction you actually want to go. Every dollar that passes through your hands has 3 possible lives. One that improves today, one that builds tomorrow, and one that keeps tomorrow's choices genuinely yours. The framework does not demand perfection. It does not require equal thirds when equal thirds are impossible. It demands only that the third category, the freedom category, never be treated as optional. Never become the first thing released when money is tight, because money is always tight in some direction, and that direction is always pointing toward the thing you haven't yet protected. Start where you are, whatever that number is. The account does not need to be impressive. It needs to exist. Open it with intention. Give it a name that means something. Fund it with what is honest, and protect it with the same seriousness you give everything else. And let the category itself begin to reshape how you move through the decisions already on their way, because they are coming. And the version of you that meets them, the one who speaks clearly when it matters, who can choose rather than comply, who walks into difficult rooms feeling something quiet and steady underneath everything. That version is built in the structure, in the third bucket that most financial frameworks never think to open. The goal was never the number. The goal was always what the number was supposed to make possible. If something in this shifted the way you see the money moving through your hands, stay with me, because next, we're going to examine something that surprised even me. What actually happens to a person's financial psychology the moment they pay off their last debt? Not relief. Not the celebration you'd expect. Something stranger and far more instructive. A specific paralysis that quietly derails more people at this exact milestone than at any other point on the financial timeline. The reason is buried in how we define freedom once we finally have it. And the answer is not what you think.